7th through 8th grade, welcome back. Our sniglet today is churro, a mysteriously hard, unchewable piece of material found in a chicken nugget. And for some reason, my word editor is telling me that unchewable is not a word, but churro is, somehow. So churro, or like churro, you just can't chew that piece of chicken. I've done that before. Sometimes it's not even, you can find that in all kinds of chicken, not just nuggets. That one piece that's rubbery and gristle. Our Shakespeare quotation is one fell swoop. You may or may not have heard this used, but the idea is that in one motion or one incident, in one time, in one fell swoop, they won the game. In one fell swoop, they knocked them all over. We don't really know. I mean, we could look it up, I'm sure, but what really, truly is a fell swoop? Does anybody know what a fell is? I don't. But it's a fun thing to say, and that's what it's come to mean. It's from Macbeth by Shakespeare. And our proverb today is Proverbs 15:23. It says, "A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is." This is all about the timing. Timing, this phrase right here, in due season, is referring to a good word spoken in a good time. Timing is important in what you say. You may or may not know this by now, but you've probably seen this yourself, that sometimes there are times to keep your mouth closed and sometimes a word is needed. And it may even be that a good word is needed, but it's not the right time. But the timing is good. A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is. All right, so we have a big topic today, so hold on to your horses. Some of you are taking a class together with Mrs. Fraser, and you're doing a literary analysis paper, and it's coming up. So I decided to go ahead and take this time to give you some tips about writing a literary analysis paper. Now, this kind of paper is very similar to a funnel method paper you might have already written, or a keyhole method, depending on what terminology you've been taught. But the point is, it still needs a strong thesis. And I love to give my students a formula for a good thesis. So we're going to start off with a formula for a good thesis, which I have taught in the other classes, or will be teaching, depending on where you are in those videos. So this is something I talk about often. I think it's super important. In fact, this is a formula. I tell my students, this isn't the only formula. This isn't the only way to do a thesis. But if you use this formula exclusively, you can use this for the rest of your writing career. You could use this formula all the way through college, grad school, post-grad school. It works. It's a good formula. So here's the formula I like to use. The subject of your paper should be the subject of your sentence. Okay, think about that carefully. I'll illustrate in a second, but the subject of your paper should be the subject of your sentence. In a thesis, you should never have a thesis that says something like, there is, or there are. I see this all the time with students. There are many ways to, no. That is a very poor thesis, okay? The subject should not be there, or some people would argue that there are sentences, the subjects are delayed. But you want your subject in the beginning, and you want it to be the subject of your paper. Okay, so if I'm writing a paper on hot dogs, then the subject of my thesis should be hot dogs. If I'm writing a paper on T-Rex, then the subject of my thesis is T-Rex. Now, for those of you who I'm going to keep going. Then you need a strong verb. Now I list here several examples. But when I say a strong verb, it should go without saying by now that means no standalone be verbs. Now, those of you, again, who've been in my classes, you've heard this before, but let's review for everyone's sake, what are our be verbs, okay? Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. You should never have one of those alone as your verb. So again, go back to here. What's the verb here? Is, there are. No, those are standalone be verbs. So stay away from standalone be verbs. Those are neutral. They're kind of like verbal equal signs. They don't really tell me anything about the subject. I want you to choose a strong verb that tells me how to think about the subject. Normally, in an argument paper, an opinion paper, it's going to be a positive or a negative verb. It's going to tell me, it's going to lean one way or the other. Kind of like our positive, negative papers at the beginning of the semester. Video games harm or video games benefit. So, but in the case of a literary analysis paper, normally what you're telling me in the verb is you're going to tell me how the subject interacts with the plot or the story or the main theme. So I gave you a list. I'm going to come back to this again. But just remember, this right here is a list of verbs. I had a pretend bag of verbs that I used in college. And I reused the same verbs from that bag of verbs for all my papers. I just rehashed and reused and recycled all of these verbs. And they all worked. And so I'm giving you some to start off with, to put in your own pretend bag of verbs that you can carry with you all the way through college, okay? Your bag will have more than just these, but this is to start you off, okay? And then you finish off the sentence. The green is your third component. So you have your subject and you have your verb. And I gave you the qualifications here. No be verbs. Tell me something about it, normally positive or negative, or how it interacts. Okay? And then the rest of the sentence, the rest of the predicate, finishes out the thought, but does not give away the points of the paper. So this is a common mistake. Some students will tell me all the points of their paper in their thesis. I don't want to know. Save, then I don't need to read your paper, right? Save that exciting information for the body of your paper. So I'll give you some examples of a literary thesis, a thesis for a literary analysis paper. So one of my examples is from a paper that I remember writing. I don't remember what the short story was, but we had all as a class read the same short story. And I noticed as we were reading that there were lots of birds in this story. Now, probably the first read through, it would seem that they were just flying through at random times and unrelated to the story. But of course, we know that literature, good literature that has stood the test of time, is not written haphazardly. Every part of the story is normally very important. And so when you take a closer look and you pay attention to details, you start to notice these intentional clues, these Easter eggs, as you might think of it, that the author has hidden in the writing for the enjoyment of the reader, to enhance what the writer is saying. So in this case, I noticed that I went back to each appearance of a bird. And I noticed, for instance, in the first part of the story, that the bird was in a cage. At the beginning of the story, the main character, the woman, also felt caged up. She was in a difficult relationship. So I thought, that's interesting. Then I looked at the next instance of a bird, and I noticed that this time the bird had escaped. And in that part of the story, guess what? It was a foreshadow for the woman herself who was going to escape this difficult relationship. And then sadly, at the end, there was an instance of another bird, and it had died. Now, I know that's a sad story, and you probably aren't enjoying reading sad stories right now, but that is truly what happened at the end. The poor young woman died. So what did I notice? Well, what I did with my thesis is I chose the subject of my paper to talk about the birds. Birds. And then for my strong verb, I didn't say are. I didn't say is, are. I could have said birds are important in this story. Nope. I could say birds are present. Nope. I don't want to say that. I want to choose a word. So I chose the word symbolize. Birds symbolize. And then I think I put the young woman's, or we could actually say reflects, would be another one that would work there. Reflects the young woman's, see, how do I want to say it? Journey. I could say something like journey or predicament or state. And there are several ways to do this, but I want to point out that the other thing you want to include is the name of the story. So I would say at the very beginning, I'm going to add, so this would be one more element, and I'm going to highlight it in a second. So I would start off my sentence by saying, and I don't remember the name of the story, I'm going to make it up. A young woman's tale, comma, birds symbolize the young woman's journey. That's my thesis. So notice I have all the elements. I have the subject of my paper as the subject of my thesis. As the verb, I have a strong verb that tells me what the subject is, how it interacts with the storyline. And then for the rest of the predicate, I explain the symbol and how it interacts. And then the last part I'm going to, I didn't include in my original formula, is you always include the title at the beginning. But that is usually in a prepositional phrase. And it's an introductory comment. Okay, that is my formula for a literary analysis paper. Now, to apply it to those of you who are writing your papers for this class, you all are writing about Joseph. So how would you start it off? In the Genesis account of Joseph, you could say it that way. In the Genesis, I ran out of space here. Let me see if I can do that. In the Genesis account, it's supposed to be a C here, of Joseph, or you could say in Joseph's story in the Bible, or you could say in Genesis chapters, whatever. Okay, so that would be my prepositional phrase at the front end. Then I'm going to choose something that you have studied and talked about in class. You can choose a certain symbol, like Joseph's coat, or you could choose a character that acts as a foil. Could be Reuben. Reuben acts as a foil character. It could be, now you don't want to pick a thesis out of thin air. I'm assuming at this point you have done quite a bit of reading, discussing, information gathering, like I know you have. You could also pick a literary device, like foreshadow or irony. And then that would be the subject of your paper. So I cannot give away my son's outline and my daughter's outline. So I'm going to switch the story to Jonah really quickly and just give you a quick little switcheroo. I'm going to erase this. I'm going to illustrate, because I actually wrote a literary analysis paper on Joseph in a Bible as literature class. I'm going to see if I can remember my thesis here. I think I can somewhat remember it. We'll try. Give it a try here. In the biblical account of Jonah, I think I tracked a specific word. Nope, I didn't. I remember now. I said direction. Direction parallels obedience. Now, what I did here, let me show you. I have my highlighter. This is my letting you know what the book is, or the story, or the source is. The subject is direction, directional words. So I tracked through the book of Jonah all of the words that say up, down, rise, fall, depths, anything that had an extreme direction. Now I know this was not my thesis precisely, but I'm trying to do it from memory. That was 20 years ago. And then my verb was parallels, or I could have said corresponds. And then the rest of my predicate tells me how does it correspond. It corresponds with obedience of the character, or I probably more precisely should say Jonah's obedience. But actually, I talk about the waves obeying God, so maybe we should just say obedience. So then, your next step is to create your outline, and we're going to talk about that too. But let me give you a couple pointers before we move on to the outline. Always, when you write a literary analysis paper, we use what's called present tense, or it's called the literary present. Notice in both of these examples I gave you, I didn't say birds symbolized past tense. Okay, I didn't say that. And I did not say direction paralleled. Okay, I kept both of them in the present tense. Now, I'm assuming you have good knowledge of present and past tense, but it's important to make sure that all of your verbs are present tense verbs. It may be strange at first if you're not used to that, but that is one of the universal requirements for writing a literary analysis paper. Then, my other pointer for this paper is choose a single literary device that you notice in the paper and demonstrate how it enhances, supports, moves along the main plot, like these two examples I gave you here. Now, the other thing is when you write your paper, you're not just retelling the story, okay? You want to assume that your audience has already read the story. And the truth is, your audience has. Because who's your audience for this paper? It's your teacher. You're writing this paper to your teacher. So your teacher, has already read this story. You are demonstrating to your teacher this symbol, or this literary device, or this really cool feature is portrayed throughout the whole story or work. So don't retell the story, but you are going to show your audience. You're going to showcase and prove your points. So each point that you make, you need to back up with evidence. And so you do that by quoting from the story. And it's like you're saying, hey, look here, see that bird? And I would quote the bird in the cage. And then I would say, see on page 72, the bird's in the cage. And then for now I'm getting into the body. So with that in mind, let's move on and talk about the body of your paper. Okay, and we're gonna continue with the birds symbolized, and then we'll do the Jonah one as well. All right, so for birds symbolized, if I'm writing my paper using the funnel method or the keyhole method, I start off by talking about the work specifically. I don't want to start off so generally that I'm too general. So I'm going to start off immediately talking about, if I'm writing about a young woman's tale, which is my made-up title for this work, I'm going to start off immediately talking about this story. Okay? I might talk about the tragedy of it or the complexity of it. I don't know, but I'm going to talk about it. And then when I get down here, I'm going to say that birds symbolized the young woman's journey. This is where my thesis goes. And so this sentence is going to go right there. In a young woman's tale, birds symbolize the young woman's journey. So I'm probably going to start off by talking about the young woman's journey and the different stages of it. Okay, so then for point one is going to go it's going to be the very next sentence, the first sentence of the next paragraph. This is going to be where point one goes. And that's where I'm going to talk about the first bird. So I would say, first, maybe I might say at the beginning of the story, or when the young woman is sitting at the kitchen table, the caged bird, and this is going to be my subject, the caged bird represents her caged heart. And then I'm going to put that sentence right here. And then I'll talk about, in this paragraph, I'm going to show a quotation that is taken from the story about the caged bird. And I'm going to point out how her heart felt that way, even though it might not say that explicitly, but she felt trapped and helpless and thought there was no way out in her relationship. Okay, that's what I'm going to do there. Then, after I show that to my reader, I quote that, I'm going to move on to the next point. And this sentence right here is going to be just like the first one. I'll probably even say, second, the bird's escape, and I'm just going to borrow from this, represents her spirit's escape from her relationship or something like that, or, depending on the story. Okay? So there again. Or I could say represents her heart's escape. However the story would dictate that you would say that. All right, that's my second sentence, and it goes right here. And then I'm going to take this paragraph to quote from the book about the bird's escape, and maybe about how her spirit was soaring now. And I'm going to talk about, how the story, her freedom is paralleled by the bird's freedom. And then lastly, and you might not always have 3 points, but in this case I did, the bird's tragic death foreshadows, if it hasn't had it happened yet in the story, or if it happens at the same time, however you would, I could just say represents again, represents her own tragic death. And it could be that maybe in this story, I don't remember, she didn't die, but her spirit did. It ended sadly. So then I would say it represents her heart's emotions, like she felt like she was dead. So just be careful to be precise. Of course, I'm making this up, but if you were really writing a literary analysis paper, you would not be making it up. So here's where the third point goes. Third, the bird's tragic death represents her own tragic death. And then I'm going to show in this paragraph a couple of quotations from the story itself. And I would show you how her death parallels it. And I would say, see, this death happened here and this death happened here at the end of the story. And then at the very end, I retell the thesis. Now, that does not mean I say it verbatim. I do not go back and say, birds, therefore, In a young woman's tale, birds symbolize the young woman's journey. But I'm also not going to rearrange it. I'm not going to say the young woman's journey has birds that symbolize her tale. I'm not going to rehash it either. That's like microwave leftovers, okay? I'm going to conclude. This is the whole point of the paper right here. So I am going to conclude that the author artistically illustrated the woman's journey through these birds. That's a very good sentence, but it's not a rehash. Okay, so now we have our restated thesis, and then we're going to write a conclusion. Again, in the conclusion, the temptation of a lot of students, and let me redraw this. It's actually more traditionally drawn like this, but a lot of students just think that you kind of rehash and reheat, microwave your paper. But no, this is where you really, I feel like, get to point out the significance of what the author did. And so in this case, it all comes together to say, to show that this woman was like a fragile bird, and her whole life, she was dictated by another person or another being, just like a bird would, a pet bird. It never truly was free, and the tragedy of that. So that's what you could discuss, for instance, in the conclusion. And it's like everything was building up to this point, and you really get to discuss it there. It's not where you're just going to re-quote yourself, okay? So that being said, that's one example with the birds. If I did it with the Jonah thesis, I'm really zooming out here. You're going to see all my notes. If I do the same thing here, here's what I would do. I would start off by talking about the story of Jonah, and its context in the Bible, him as a prophet, probably give a little bit of background. And then I would end with my thesis. So right here, again, is where my thesis is going to go. In the biblical account of Jonah, direction parallels obedience. So then my first point is going to be, and again, I'm doing this from memory, so I'm somewhat making it up, but I think in the Bible, after God tells him to go to Nineveh, it says he goes down to Joppa. So I would say, first, direction demonstrates his disobedience, but creation's obedience, which is interesting because in that beginning part, he goes down, but everything else goes up. The sea rises up. It says that I think the whale rose up. Everything, creation was obeying, and the direction was up, and Jonah was down. And then, of course, the solution to his disobedience was him being tossed into the depths of the ocean. I don't remember my paper, but I just remember it was interesting, the directions and the significance in the story, because he goes down to the bottom of the ocean, and then he prays and is immediately brought up and cast off onto the beach. And so each of these times, direction, it doesn't determine his obedience, it just kind of demonstrates it. Now he's up on the beach, and then a plant rises up and shades him, and then a worm eats it, and it dies. But again, I think the terminology is used in directions. So that is what I did with this paper, and each of my points was a illustration of this in the storyline. And then my conclusion, my whole point in this is that the significance of obedience, and how it affected Jonah's life. When he obeyed, things went well, and when he disobeyed, things went poorly for him. So that was the point of the paper. And so you all are writing on Joseph. And so if you take your themes and your observations that you've come up with in your class, you can create a strong thesis. If you start here, if you have a really strong thesis, then your paper should just pretty much write itself, okay? So I hope you do well on it. I know you've been doing a lot of reading and studying on this, which is excellent. Excellent. 90% of your paper is done before you ever start writing. It's all the reading and analysis and observation and discussion. 10% is writing. So if you feel like you've done a lot of reading up to this point, then good job. Good for you. All right, so we're going to conclude there. Your homework is to write a literary analysis outline. Now, if you're in Mrs. Peggy's class, you're going to write your outline and your paper, and you're going to turn it into Mrs. Peggy, okay? If you are not in Mrs. Peggy's class and you're doing this for your parent, choose a story that you're already reading and studying in literature. I recommend a short story, not a long story, and do what we have done in this paper, but spend a lot of time observing. If you need a suggestion, take my Jonah story. You can even borrow my thesis, and you can look and study all the directions, and you can notice that creation obeys, even Nineveh repents and obeys, and Jonah obeys sometimes and he disobeys sometimes. You can write that paper, or you can choose Joseph or any other story that you'd like. All right, I will see you all next week. I hope this is a help.